So I will speak about the Missouri project, which lasted from November 2020 to November 2021. It stands for Microplastics in Soils and Groundwater, Sources, Transfer, Metrology, and Impact. This project was led by INERIS, the French National Institute for Industrial Environment and Risks in France, with two partners, VU, Vrije Universiteit from the Netherlands, and the Belgium Walloon Public Service Institute, ICEP. It was funded by the French Agency for Ecological Transition, ADEME, the Walloon Public Service Agency, SPW, and the Dutch Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management. There were 4 goals for the project. First, it was to propose an harmonized definition of microplastics. Second, to review and experiment analytical approach for measuring microplastics in soil, mainly. After, to review the occurrence, sources, and impacts of microplastics in soils and groundwater. And then to propose policy and technical recommendations. This was done by consulting different stakeholders involved in microplastic research and development, in analytical approach also. It was also done for analytical review by using Interlab Study. And we organized a workshop also with international experts involved in microplastics in soil research to discuss all of these elements. So regarding harmonized definition, the different stakeholders we have consulted proposed mainly a common definition for microplastics with a size between 100 nanometer and 5 millimeter. But some stakeholders proposed to differentiate small and large microplastics. Others propose microplastics with a size higher to 1 micrometer. And we have also an answer regarding the ISO TR 21960 definition. And people involved in sludge and fertilizer asked for size lower than 2 millimeter. Regarding the different types of microplastics we should study in priority, many of the people ask for PE, PP, PES, so polyethylene, polypropylene, polystyrene, and mixtures of microplastics. But the answers are mainly depending on the field of expertise. Regarding the review on analytical research, what you have here is what we published in the Journal of Environmental Chemical Engineering. We identified the classical methodologies that you have here. And present also some emerging techniques to measure and qualify the microplastics in soil, mainly. So I invite you to look at this paper. Regarding the Interlab study, we did this by using a 4-step approach. First, a spiking of different soils with microplastics. This was done by ICEP. After, Casimem in Netherlands distributed the different samples of soils to the lab, which participated to this ILS study. And after made the statistical analysis, and these results were interpreted by VU. Here you have the different soils that were used, mainly sandy soils. There were 2 kinds of soil. One which was made by hand, and the other one which was taken from an industrial site. And we spiked them with 3 types of microplastics, PE, PMMA, and PS, with different concentration also. 25 labs participated to the study, mainly coming from Europe. And here you have the results of this Interlab. According to the type of plastics, to the samples, and you have the difference observed between the spiked value and what was measured. mainly in particle number per kilogram of soil. And what you can see here, it's the main difference observed was for PMMA. And the hypothesis we made is that PMMA adhere to glass of the bottles. That's why we cannot measure all of them. Regarding the review on occurrence, sources, and impacts of microplastics in soils and groundwater, you can find also in the paper I mentioned before, the occurrence that we identified according to the different types of land use, mainly agricultural fields, farmland, and mainly in China also. It's quite difficult to extrapolate one microplastic per land use. But what we can see that for farmland, there are a lot of microplastics which were measured, mainly PA, PE, PS also. Regarding the occurrence, in the right here, there are large difference in terms of occurrence, and sometimes it's difficult to compare the occurrence because the report is not done by the same way. Sometimes it's in pieces per kilogram of soil. You have it also in number of particles per kilogram, items per kilogram, and so on. For the sources, we made also a literature review based on text mining techniques. And what we observed is that was also published by Carre et al. In 2018. We have primary sources of microplastics coming from industry, but we have also mainly secondary plastics coming from agriculture because of the use of plastic mulch, for instance, or the application of sludge coming from wastewater treatment. We have also atmospheric deposition of microplastics coming from erosion and abrasion of synthetic rubber tires from landfills also. Regarding the impacts, we looked at the impacts for soil properties, so for the general ecosystem of soil. We looked also at impacts for terrestrial fauna and observed that it's mainly gastropods, earthworms, bacteria, enzyme activities which were tackled or observed. For the terrestrial flora, we have as endpoints observed plant growth, rhizosphere, chlorophyll content, or reactive oxidative stress. And for humans, we have studies mainly with in vitro cells looking at DNA, mitochondria, oxidative stress, enzyme activity, and so on, but also in vivo studies. And it's very difficult to say that we have always some impacts of microplastics. It depends. Sometimes we have, sometimes we don't have. But it's very difficult to compare also the different results because the experimental conditions are not the same. We don't look so much at the availability of the microplastics within the natural ecosystems also. So we looked more at the dangers, the hazards. And we did this not only for microplastics, but also for the additive and mainly BPA. For the technical and policy recommendations from the workshop we organized, we made some conclusions. So mainly about questions. So what is measured in terms of microplastics? Sometimes it's not the same. So we need really a standardized definition and testing methods. We need standardized characterization and measurements methods also. When we speak about hazards and risks, it is not the same. So we need also to differentiate the two. And we have the problem of the specificity of the lab experiments. So what I said before, it's very difficult to extrapolate what is observed in lab conditions to the fields. We don't have not enough knowledge on exposure to microplastics. We need also better knowledge on the interactions between microplastics and environment. We need long-term also characterization and impact study on exposure on biological systems. We need also low dose exposure to study also their impacts, not only of the microplastics itself, but also the additives on biological systems. And working on standardization, we will have, of course, standardized sampling techniques, also standardized separation, extraction methods, identification, quantification techniques, accompanied to quality analysis, quality control, reference and certified materials by using also Interlab studies. This will help to have a global monitoring of microplastics and to have better knowledge of fate, transport and effects that will be compared also all around the world. Regarding the recommendation in terms of policy and technical standards, we should differentiate intentional plastic use and unintentional plastic spread in the environment. So for the first one, we need safe by design approach combined with socioeconomic analysis and the involvement of people involved in material research for finding relevant substitutes to microplastics and additives. And this will be maybe eased by cross-sectoral policies. We need to promote the fair approach by also having accessible all the data and interoperable all the data of the research. And we need for that also the involvement of scientists for the dissemination of the results. And regarding unintentional plastic spread in the environment, it will be limited by using a nature-based solution and by promoting bioremediation techniques. And for that, we need transdisciplinary between researchers and between also experts, policy scientists also. Regarding the impact of this project, we have one scientific publication now, and we are preparing 3 others. We raised awareness by the production of a pedagogic brochure and by organizing and participating to different workshops. We have identified gaps for future research and policies. So here you have the scientific publication. So the first one, the other one should be on groundwater and health impact, on soil ecosystems also, and the microplastics on human health effects. Here you have an overview of the pedagogic brochure we made. This was challenged by representatives of the society like NGO, public authorities and private stakeholders. It is now published in the SOILveR website. Considering also the relationship with other projects, when we organized the workshop, we ask people involved in the IMTOX project, which is the H2020 project on toxicology, to participate. We ask also people involved in Euroculture, which made, in fact, inter-laboratory study also on microplastics in sediments, water, and biological matrix to participate. And I think we will speak about that in one of the sessions, a parallel session afterwards. We participated also to a national workshop on organized by ADEM, and we exchanged with the different partners. Regarding the soil strategy and the relationships, so here I identified the main actions that are tackled in this strategy, and what I can propose is that Missouri helped to promote sustainable soil management through the common agricultural policy and to share also best practices. We proposed also to some solutions to restore degraded soils and contaminated sites. We proposed also some standardized techniques for data and monitoring on soil. And of course, we mobilized the necessary societal engagement and financial resources that we can also provide by the same way for this soil strategy. The follow-up of the project will be for some of our partners to acquire some analytical equipment to continue to perform the research. We will launch also some PhD thesis and some research project within institutes with partners identified along the project. And we will answer also to the SOILveR calls and maybe Horizon Europe to have also opportunity for experimental research. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Florence. So please ask your question on the discussion. There's one. No, Hélène Roussel will. Hélène, you're on mute.
Is that better with that? Yeah? Can you? Okay, perfect. Giving some time to people to add your question on the discussion form. Florence, can you tell us how many papers you have reviewed for the literature review? Do you have an idea of the total number of papers that you have read?
I would say around 400 papers. That's why we used also this text mining approach in order to help us to first stratify the different papers and after to prioritize also what we should read or not.
My other question is about the necessary knowledge on exposure and exposure to microplastics and interaction between microplastic and environment. Do you feel that there is a need, especially in soil matrix or in aquatic matrix, which is the less studied compartment?
I think we need both. The priority should be also for aquatic and for soil. Regarding aquatic, for instance, if we speak about exposure, it's mainly to speak about potential impact on human health and of course on ecosystems. But regarding human health, the main exposure we can have from water drinking, for instance, could be to look at the PVC impact and to see if PVC can be found in water, in drinking tap water, for instance. And this question is doesn't have still answer regarding this, because first I mentioned the analytical approach that should be standardized. We don't know finally what we try to measure. Also, when we imagine that we have a definition, it's very difficult to measure them still because of the limit of analytical, because of the analytical limits also. So this should be quite obvious in terms of studying exposure. Look at drinking water, for instance. So imagine when we have another media, which is food, when trying to look at the exposure of microplastic from soil, it's mainly from the food. And because of packaging, it's also very difficult to say afterwards it's because of packaging or it's because of the transfer of microplastic from soil to food. So yeah, maybe my answer was quite long, but yeah, to have a clear answer, I would say we should do both priority. Yeah.
Thanks, Florence. There is a question from Dietmar, which says that maybe 2 millimeters as for microplastic in sludge likely stem from a background of sewage sludge as soil amendments, and comparison to the classic particle size of a soil sample which are sieved below 2 millimeters. So I guess the question of Dietmar is about monitoring, measuring soil concentration while when you are sieving classical soil samples below 2 millimeters and sludge contents, which is over 2 millimeters, are just discarded and not measured. Did you add discussion about this size analysis questions?
Yeah, so it was my colleague Julie Albrecht spoke with stakeholders regarding this answer provided by them. And since it's mainly coming from people involved in sludge and fertilizer, we ask also why this limit. And yeah, this is a size for which the wastewater treatment filtration is maximal. And this is a maximum size of impurities a compost or a digestate can contain. That's why they report 2 millimeters. I don't know if it answers to Dietmar.
We see if there is more question. I guess Dietmar can add them in the chat. Two other questions which are more or less related. One from Charlotta is, do you have an idea of what are the main sources of microplastics in soil? And a more precise one from Esther, which is asking the sources in human bodies in order of importance. So if you could do soil and then human bodies.
Okay, so the main sources of microplastics in soils depends on which soils. For instance, when speaking about agricultural soils, it's mainly coming from mulching, plastic mulching, and sludge amendments, compost. When speaking about industrial sites, it can be, of course, from the activity of the industry itself, but also from atmospheric deposition. We were very surprised to see that there are a lot of microplastics in the mountains where you don't have any activities. Anthropic activity. You have also microplastics found in Antarctic. So we have long-range transport of microplastics all around the world. Yeah. Regarding the microplastics in human bodies, it's a very big question, if I can say that, because there was one study founded which found microplastics in placenta. But we don't know if it was due to analytical impurities or not still. So it's a very big question. This needs to be, we need biomonitoring, of course, but I cannot say that what are the main sources of microplastics. We know that there are long-range transports of microplastics, and there are microplastics also in atmosphere. So we can imagine that we are inhalating microplastics, for instance. We are drinking microplastics also.